All right, everybody, ready for another deep dive.
Let's do it.
Today, we are tackling complete English for beginners. All 90 lessons.
Wow, 90 lessons. That's quite a bit.
It is. It is. But don't worry, we're not going to go through every single lesson, thank goodness.
Yeah.
But, the thing that really struck me, and I think this is where the real juicy stuff is, it's not so much about, the specifics of English grammar, right?
Right.
But it's like this book has accidentally stumbled on, maybe not accidentally, but, uncovered these sort of universal truths about how we learn language.
Yeah.
Just by the way that they've structured the whole thing.
Definitely.
So I thought it'd be fun to kind of go through and see if we can extract some of that and, think about how we can apply that to anything, really.
For sure. I mean, even just glancing at this book, you can tell right away that it's structured in a way that's really meant to help people learn effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because they could have just been like, here's a dictionary, starting with A, go learn all these words. But that's not how our brains work, right?
Absolutely not.
Our brains crave context.
It's true. I mean, just think about it. If you learn a word in isolation, you're much less likely to remember it.
Exactly.
Than if you learn it as part of a phrase, something you might actually say in real life.
Yeah, or even just like a scenario, right?
Yeah.
Like if you can picture yourself at the zoo, you're more likely to remember the word elephant.
Exactly. And this book, it's called Complete English for Beginners, but when you really look at it, it's more than that. It's like a blueprint for how to approach any kind of learning, really.
Yeah, I'm with.
By breaking it down into these manageable chunks.
Yeah, these bite-sized pieces. So I guess what we're really getting at here is what can we learn? What can we steal from this complete English for Beginners book?
Exactly. And how can we apply those lessons to, our own lives, whether it's, learning a new language or a new skill.
Okay, so let's jump in. Now, we've got 90 lessons to play with here. We're not going to hit every single one. But let's start with, just the overall structure, because even that, I think, speaks volumes.
Totally. And you know what struck me right away?
What's that?
Every single lesson follows the exact same format. You've got the lesson itself, with explanations and examples, and then boom, you've got the answers.
Okay, interesting. So they're really emphasizing this active learning thing.
Absolutely. It's not just about passively taking in information.
Right.
They want you to actually use it, to test yourself, to see if you've really understood.
And that's huge. I mean, think about it. How many times have we, sat in a lecture or read a textbook and thought, yeah, I got this.
Totally.
But then when it comes to actually applying that knowledge, it's like, wait, what was that again?
Exactly. And that's where those answer sections come in.
Right. It's like they're building in that accountability from the get-go.
Exactly.
And it reminds me of, have you ever heard of that study technique? They call it spaced repetition.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Flashcards, right.
Yeah.
Where you space out the intervals so you're not just cramming.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is that by testing yourself at these strategic intervals, you're actually forcing your brain to work harder to recall the information.
Makes sense.
And in a way, this book is doing something similar, right? It's like, okay, you've learned about present tense verbs. Now let's see if you can actually conjugate them.
Exactly. They're not letting you off the hook, which is a good thing.
It's like a workout for your brain.
It totally is. And another thing that's really interesting about the structure of this book is how they've organized the actual content of the lessons.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Because they could have easily gone the traditional route.
Yeah.
Start with the alphabet, then move on to basic grammar rules and so on. But they didn't.
They didn't? So what did they do?
They focused on themes, everyday situations. And I think that's brilliant.
Like what kind of themes are we talking? Give me an example.
Sure. So you'll see lessons titled My Pencil Case, At the Zoo, In the Kitchen, Even Feelings.
Interesting. So it's very much grounded in practical, real-world stuff.
Exactly. Because let's be honest, how often do you actually need to explain the intricacies of the past perfect continuous tense in real life?
Not very often, unless you're a time traveler.
Right. But, being able to describe your family or order food at a restaurant, that's something you might actually use.
Okay, so they're prioritizing the stuff that's going to be most useful for beginners.
Exactly. And I think that's another key takeaway here. Start with what's relevant. Don't get bogged down in the minutia before you even have a basic foundation.
Love it. So it's not just about learning English, it's about learning how to learn.
Absolutely. And what's so clever about organizing the lessons around these everyday themes?
What's that?
It plays to our brain's natural strengths. You know, our brains are wired to make connections, to see patterns.
Right.
So when you learn vocabulary and grammar in the context of, say, at the fruit market, you're not just memorizing isolated words.
It's like you're actually there, right?
Exactly. You're building a mental picture, a little scene in your head.
And that just makes it stick so much better.
Way better. It's like, imagine trying to memorize a random list of fruits versus like picturing yourself actually at a market, you know, smelling the right mangoes, haggling over prices.
Okay, that's a good point. It's so much more vivid. Right.
So much. And because it's tied to this real life experience, this thing you can imagine yourself doing, it just sticks in your brain so much better.
So it's almost like they're sneaking the learning in, right?
Totally. It's like, oh, I'm not even studying. I'm just picturing myself buying some delicious fruit.
Exactly. It's funny how our brains work that way, isn't it?
It's amazing. And you know, it makes me think, this whole idea of using context and themes, it's not just limited to language learning, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, think about any skill, really. Like if you're trying to learn how to code, you don't just start with the most abstract concepts, do you?
No way.
You start with a simple project, something you can actually build.
Exactly, like a to-do list app or a simple game.
Yeah. And in a way, that's what this Complete English for Beginners book is doing, isn't it? It's giving you these little projects, these everyday scenarios that allow you to apply what you're learning in a meaningful way.
Totally. It's about building up your skills gradually, one step at a time.
Okay, so we've talked about the overall structure, the emphasis on active learning, and the use of themes and context. What else can we glean from this treasure trove of language learning wisdom?
Well, I think it's also worth noting the types of scenarios they've chosen to focus on.
Like what?
Okay, so we've got things like my family, my house, at the restaurant, going shopping.
Good universal stuff, right?
Exactly. These are experiences that almost everyone can relate to, regardless of their background or culture.
And I guess that's smart because it means the learner can immediately start connecting the dots, right?
Exactly. It's like they're tapping into this shared human experience, this common ground that we all share.
And that makes the learning process feel less like I'm trying to cram this foreign language into my brain and more like I'm just trying to communicate about my day-to-day life.
Exactly. And, you know, it makes me think about how important it is to find those connections, those points of relevance, no matter what you're trying to learn.
Like if you can find a way to connect it to something you're already passionate about or something you do every day.
Absolutely. It's about finding those hooks that make the information feel personal and meaningful.
And that's when the magic really happens, right? When it stops feeling like work and starts feeling like, oh, this is actually interesting. I want to learn more. It's funny, isn't it? We start with this simple little English book for a beginner's expert speaker.
Yeah.
And suddenly we're like knee-deep in brain science and the secrets of the universe.
I know, right? It's like, who knew there was so much to learn from my pencil case?
Right. But seriously, though, I think there's something really profound about what we've been talking about. This idea that learning at its core is about making connections.
Totally. And that's something this book does brilliantly, don't you think? Like it takes these seemingly random everyday situations and shows how they're all connected by this underlying structure of language.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, you already know how to navigate the world around you. Now let's just give you the words to do it in English.
Right. And I love how they emphasize that active learning piece, too. The answer sections aren't just an afterthought. They're like front and center, reminding you that learning is a two-way street.
It's like they're saying, don't just sit there and passively absorb this stuff. Get in there and wrestle with it. Make some mistakes. That's how you know it's really sinking in.
Exactly. And you know what? I think that's a good lesson for all of us, no matter what we're trying to learn. Whether it's English or coding or playing the ukulele.
Okay, so let's bring it all home for our listeners.
Yeah.
Imagine you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but what does it actually look like in my own life?
Right. How do I take these principles, these insights from Complete English for Beginners and apply them to, you know, my own personal Mount Everest of knowledge?
Exactly. So let's say you're trying to learn, I don't know, how to bake the perfect sourdough bread.
Okay, sourdough. Delicious but tricky.
Right. It's notoriously finicky. So you could just try to follow a recipe blindly, but we all know how that usually turns out.
Yeah, been there, done that. Ended up with a very sad flat pancake.
Exactly. So instead, imagine if you approached it with this building blocks mentality. Like instead of just memorizing measurements and temperatures, you really try to understand the why behind each step.
So like learning about the science of yeast and gluten.
Yes. And maybe you even seek out those answer sections, those opportunities for active learning. Maybe you experiment with different flyer types or proofing times.
You're basically treating each loaf of bread like a little mini experiment.
Exactly. In the process, you're not just learning how to bake, you're learning how to think like a baker. And that, my friends, is where the real magic happens.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Not just acquiring knowledge for the sake of it, but actually using it to create something, to grow, to become more well-rounded humans.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What are the building blocks in your own life? What are those skills or areas of knowledge you've always wanted to master? And more importantly, how can you break them down into manageable chunks, ground them in real-world context, and make them your own?
Keep those sourdough starters bubbling.
Until next time,
Yeah.
happy learning.